Hello everyone and welcome to another BlockChyp Lab series video. Today we're going to talk about three big new features that will be coming to the platform. This is the gateway and the firmware over the coming weeks. The first one is contactless EMV. So after a lot of fanfare and a fairly difficult certification process, it's very tricky to go through contactless EMV certification, as many in the industry already know. But that's been wrapped up and that'll be coming out in probably right after RSPA. We've also expanded payment method and card brand support. We have added Diners Club JCB UnionPay support, and this is contactless, the full smash. We've also added EBT support, so that means pin-based CVMs and all the rest. Then we've been doing a lot of fine-tuning on the store and forward system. In particular, one of the things that we've tried to work on is how do we make the store and forward system testable so that it's not just something that we tell you is there and you hope works when you need it, but you can actually test it as a developer, simulate store and forward events and the different failure methods and ensure that it works. So for that reason, I'm actually running everything locally off my own workstation today instead of using our test gateways so that I can do things like knock the gateway over, knock it offline on purpose so we can simulate different failure modes when we get to store and forward. But we'll start with some of the fun stuff. Let's go ahead and do a really simple contactless EMV transaction. I'm going to go ahead and get this up. You can see the terminal wakes up. Now you can see all the additional card brand logos, but I'm just going to do a basic Discover card. I'm going to tap it. It's authorizing, it's approved, and it's done. Let's see what that looks like in the dashboard. I'll open this up, and you can see now it shows up as a tap transaction. If I were to look at the current batch, you can see now I've got a Discover card in here, and I've got a tap transaction. Let's do a couple more just for fun. So let's do a different amount this time. How about something small like $12? And I'll do a MasterCard contactless this time. And that's going. And this one wants a signature CVM. And you can see this, the card does say signature. So this is a signature CVM working with contactless. And that works. And if I refresh this page, now I have the contactless transaction with the signature. So you can see that. Let's do an ApplePay transaction. Actually, let's get back to where I was in the dashboard. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and let's start another one here. I'll change the amount to maybe 15. Going to get my phone ready here. And I will go ahead and the terminal will wake up. I will enter my passcode off camera for my test. And there's my phone. It's authorizing and it's approved. So that's basically contactless. There's not much to it. It just, the way that it changes things a little bit is that they show up as tap transactions here. So if you want to be able to see what proportion of your entry methods are tap versus something else, you can. So that's contactless. Not much to it really. It just basically works. Let's go ahead and do let's do some international card brand transactions. So I'm going to go ahead and change the amount and set up another transaction. I'm going to grab one of my test cards. We do have MagStripe. There are EMV, contact, and contactless test cards available for the international card brands. But when we ship out new developer kits, those are going to come with MagStripe test cards. And that's really just a cost thing. It's just so that you have the ability to make sure your system handles all the different card brand codes correctly without needing to pay for expensive EMV test cards for these other brands. You can get them if you want them, but they're not required. So I'm going to be using our standard MagStripe test for these. So let's start with this one, and I'll swipe a JCB test card for the Japan Card Bureau, and that's going to go, and it's going to prompt me for a signature, and I will hit done. And let's see what that does to my current batch. If I refresh this, now you can see the JCB logo shows up with the transaction, and then there's the MagStripe. So that's there. Let's go ahead and do Diners Club, which is really just kind of a other brand of Discover, but we'll do it. So I'll go ahead and swipe this card for Discover, or for Diners Club, and it's running. We'll do a signature since this is a MagStripe transaction, and then here we are, and I'll refresh it. And now Diners Club is showing up here. You'll notice in this sort of by card brand breakdown, it's not going to show a line for some of these card brands that are not used as frequently in the US unless you actually have some transaction volume for those brands. So if people never use these cards, they're not cluttering up your screens. All right, let's do one more for UnionPay. And we'll change the amount to, we'll do 2323. If I can type correctly, guys. Let's try that. and I'll swipe the UnionPay card. It's authorizing. I'll sign it. And now let's see how things change. And there it is. You can see I've got UnionPay, I've got Diners Club and JCB all working in here. Okay, now we're going to do an EBT transaction. So if you look here, I've got my command line utility up and running here, and you have to add an extra option here. So you have to add this EBT flag in order to enable EBT. The merchant account also has to have EBT enabled, and the terminal has to be configured for PIN-based CVM. So assuming all of that is in place, this should work. So I will light this up. It's going to ask me to present a card. I will swipe it. It's going to ask me to enter a PIN. I will enter a test PIN, and it will authorize and it's approved. And so now if I refresh this screen, you can see that, let me get back to it, I have an EBT transaction. All right, so these are all the new card brand methods, and you can see that we've gotten contactless working. So now we're going to talk about store and forward. Store and forward, if for those of you not familiar with this is basically the industry lingo for what happens if you want to still conditionally accept transactions at the point of sale, even if the connection to us or to our backend processors are down. So what typically happens is there's some kind of a criteria, usually a floor limit. In our case, you have the ability to set a floor limit for these kind of transactions right here, the store and forward floor limit. So what you might say is, if the internet is down, if there's some other system error that would prevent transactions from processing at this exact moment, you can say, I'm going to go ahead and conditionally accept transactions up to a certain limit. The default is 50, but you might want to raise it or lower it depending on your risk tolerance. So assuming this is set up, we can simulate a couple of different failure modes. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is I'm just going to knock the gateway over. So I have the gateway running here. So this dashboard and everything that I'm running, I'm just going to shut it off. Actually, I'm going to shut it off in midstream. I'm going to start by starting a new transaction. This will not be EBT. We'll just do normal transaction here. So I will take one of my contactless cards. I will light the terminal up. Now, let's assume that the gateway fails at that exact moment. I have just shut the gateway off. There is nothing this can talk to. And I'll go ahead and tap the card. And it's been approved. So now what I can do, and that's because it was below the floor limit. Let's try this again with something above $50. So let's go with something like, let's do $73.45. And I'll do the exact same thing again. This time we'll do it with a contactless Amex. And I'll present the card. And this time it was declined. And if you look at the actual error message, as you can see over here in it says network unreachable. So this is how we would handle it in a situation like that. All right, well, let's bring the gateway back up and see if these transactions actually make it to the server. So the time delay is 2 minutes. So what will happen is, if it will try to send offline store and forward transactions back up to the gateway every 2 minutes. And the reason that the interval is 2 minutes is because it allows a little bit of extra time in the event that there's signature capture. So if an authorization fails, then I can see the transactions going through right now. So that's pretty good. So I'll go ahead and go back to test merchants, and you can see there's the charge that was the one that we did that was below the floor limit. If I click on it, you're going to see a little bit of an extra note here that this was actually a store and forward transaction. You're actually going to see an extra timestamp called terminal timestamp too. So this shows you the actual time that the transaction was processed on the local machine compared to when it was done server side. And we've obviously created some exaggerated time differences here for test purposes. So what happens if a transaction is declined via store and forward? Well, I'm going to do the same thing again. This time I'm going to take my decline test card, which is a test card we use to simulate declines. I'm going to go ahead and send another transaction to the terminal. It will make it below the floor limit so that it tries to store and forward. I'll do that. Now I'm going to knock the system offline, and I'm going to swipe the card. It's going to ask me to sign. And this transaction was approved offline because we don't have the ability to know if it's going to decline or not. So now I'll bring the gateway back up, and I can show you what happens in this situation. And that is the risky thing about supporting store and forward, is that you do have the risk of having to make other arrangements with a customer to get payment, or just taking the loss. That's the risk. And so it's something that we don't turn on by default. We really feel like you should think it through, make sure you understand your situation, your fraud vulnerability, and your just general rate of declines before you turn it on. So the gateway is now back on. We're waiting for the terminal to send the store and forward transaction to the server. I may edit some bits out so you guys don't have to wait with me. Okay, looks like that's coming through now. So now you can see I have a swipe that was declined. And if I open this up, you're going to see a little note here that this was a store and forward transaction that was declined offline. So this is really the risk of store and forward. Just kind of an FYI. Let's try some more interesting failure modes. So what I'm going to do is I actually went ahead and dug out the network interface for this terminal, because I don't want you to take my word for it, because I can't really show you how I knock the gateway offline, but I can show you how I unplug an Ethernet cable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to initiate another store and forward transaction. Okay, so now we're going to do this. The terminal is awake, and at this exact moment, I'm going to unplug the terminal's network cable. And then I'm going to, let's do a contact MX this time. And we'll put that in. And it wants a PIN. We'll enter one. Okay, so this is what, by default, there's a 15-second timeout. Some types of network failures, you failed right away. Some network failures take a little while for there to be a timeout. By default, the terminals have a 15-second timeout, so that's what we're waiting on right here. But you can see it was approved conditionally offline. I'll remove the card. Now I'll take the network cable and plug it back in. And then we'll wait for the terminal to reestablish communication with the network. All right, so we go back. So now here's the transaction that we just ran. It made it to the server just fine once the network connection was reestablished. All right, so this is all well and good. So I'm showing you how store and forward works in real situations where there's a network problem or an outage. Well, it's kind of tough to test these things. If you're a developer and you want to work with this stuff, how can you simulate an outage? How can you simulate a store and forward transaction if you can't simulate an outage? Obviously, you could do what I did. There's a couple things you can do as a developer to simulate store and forward conditions. You can use the timeout test card. So we have this test card right here that simulates a timeout. You could initiate a transaction and just swipe this card. And what will happen is the server will deliberately sit and just never return a response. And it's actually 30 seconds, but the terminal will time out before then. If you have, if you're familiar with BlockChyp's adverse event system, you can actually increase this delay if you want. But you can see it timed out, and I got a conditional authorization. So now that's approved. Let's try one above the floor limit just so we can see how that works. So I'll set this one to 55.34, and we'll swipe it again. But this time it will probably wait. So we'll have to wait for a timeout. And I get a connection error. So I get an error telling me that it can't go through. And that's basically the system saying, hey, I can't authorize this transaction. So we're going to go ahead and let the user know. Okay, so there's also other ways to simulate transactions, store and forward transaction. One is there's a special code. If you use amounts that are all sevens, this will automatically cause a store and forward simulation. Of course, this just works for test accounts. It doesn't work for live transactions. But if I were to enter an amount of 7.77 and do that, and then I can use any card I want, and it says it's been approved, right? Because it was simulated offline. There it goes. I'm seeing it over here on my other screen. So now if I refresh the dashboard, now I see I've got a store and forward transaction for $7.77 that's come through. We also have the ability to do this. So the reason that we make it all sevens instead of any particular trigger amount is so that you can simulate above and below floor limit transactions, depending on what your floor limits are. So if I change this to 777, and just for fun, I'll swipe an American Express test card this time. And I get an instant connection error because it didn't work. Because it's above the floor limit, so it's not going to go through. One of the reasons that we do it this way also is so that you can simulate declined store and forward transactions. So let me do one that's below the floor limit again. And I'm gonna take, we have a special test card, this one right here, that allows you to simulate declines. I'm gonna go ahead and run this transaction. It's gonna wake up. I'm gonna swipe the decline test card. I'm gonna sign it because it approved it. And then we're gonna wait for this to get shipped up to the network. It's gonna take it a minute or two. Okay, so the transaction has come through. You can see there it is. It's 777. If I click on it, it's basically a declined offline or a declined store and forward transaction. So that's basically how store and forward works. In most payment systems, you get some kind of vague commitment that store and forward might be there or it might be there in the future. But store and forward transactions, as we've learned the hard way implementing this, that they are a little different from conventional transactions. And so we wanted to make sure that we not only had good support for it, but that it was easy for point of sale developers to test with. So you could actually integrate this kind of store and forward testing as part of your normal release process. And that's why we've kind of included special test cards and special trigger amounts for all of this, so that you can really see how the system behaves when what happens if a store and forward transaction is declined. It's not the kind of thing you should wait until it happens to figure out. You should be ahead of it. So that's basically the update at this point. We looked at contactless EMV, pretty straightforward. We showed you EBT and the international card brands and how store and forward works. So that's going to be it. We're heading off to RSPA, and we'll see you next time on the Lab Series.